Thank you very much. What I'd like to talk about today is some work that was funded by the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, so thank you very much for that, and which looks at Australia's country towns in 2050. And one of the important strands in the NCCARF research program over the last several years has been trying to understand what Australia's urban system, what the settlement system will look like as we head towards 2050 and even beyond, particularly in light of climate change. And we all know, particularly those of us who live in South Australia, that our urban settlement system changes over time. You don't have to drive too far into the Mallee or up into the mid-north to realise there are places there that used to be there that are no longer places, and instead they're just wrecks or hulks of settlements in the past. And there are other places that previously performed one economic function that have been reinvented into another function and perhaps converted into a third. A friend of mine lives in the mid-north, and she tells me how where she lives previously had an economic function, which is about agriculture, but has now moved into something else, including serving as a tree change location in a landscape without trees, urbanists from Adelaide. What this really makes you think about is, well, how will Australia's urban settlement system look like, or settlement system look like in 2050 in light of climate change? What will happen if we see the variability that's forecast? What will happen when there will be changes in rainfall patterns? And what will happen when we see the changes in temperature? Will the existing industries still be there? Will they disappear? Will they change? Or what will happen? And how will those communities adapt over time, if at all? Or will many of them simply disappear, and will the Australian population retreat lager-like into the metropolitan areas alone and leave large agribusiness and stations to manage the inland regions? So this research is really about understanding our country towns. So we did not look at the coastal locations, because we asked not to look at coastal locations, but essentially we were asked to look at all those places that were non-metropolitan and more than 50 kilometres from the coast. And we were particularly asked, or we particularly proposed that we undertake research into looking at vulnerability. So we tried to develop an index of vulnerability that reflected the capacity of these places to survive into the future. And these vulnerability indexes are quite commonly used, sometimes discredited, sometimes supported, but they provide an important first point as a way of understanding which places are more at risk and which places are less at risk. So a poor score on this index doesn't necessarily mean that a place is doomed. What it does mean is that it's at greater risk compared to other places. And these indexes take into account not just the level of exposure and the level of risk being faced by the place, but also make some measure for adaptive capacity. And this research was published in its draft form back in the middle of the year, and I received quite a bit of feedback on it, and we're now moving to a point where we'll be hopefully releasing the final version of the report soon after the end of this month. And I think what's really important to emphasise is this pattern. So it's a fairly simple way of understanding this map, and the one key point is that red is bad and the yellow dots are better. And what we see when we look at this map is that places that are most vulnerable are those places that are more remote, those places that are more indigenous, and those places that are more difficult to gain access to. So it's many of the existing communities that are already struggling that are going to be most affected by climate change. That's one of the key findings of the research. So if you think about parts of the Northern Territory, which can only be accessed by air in the wet season, climate change may well mean that parts of the APY lands will also only be accessible by air during key parts of the year because of climate change reasons. So Indigenous Australia is at risk, not just because of where they live, but also because of their social and economic structure. What makes you adaptable? What makes you adaptable in large measure is about the resources you can control, which includes income, but also includes things such as human capital. Your level of education is a very good surrogate for human capital. So places with poorer levels of education are less adaptable. So that's one of the key points. Okay. So that's one of the key points I'd make. In the research, we also looked at a number of case studies and used a Delphi analysis where we tapped into expert opinion. One of the key points I'd like to make, I think it's a very important point, is that in undertaking the case studies, most places that we visited either struggled to talk about climate change and adaptation to it, or refused to talk about it, or could not recognise that they've been affected by the sorts of events that may well be linked to climate change. Two of the case studies that I went to were Junee in New South Wales and Maurik in the Central Coalfields of Queensland. And when I had discussions with people, they said, no, we don't have any climate change planning, we've never been affected by climate change, it's not important. Junee almost ran out of water in 2010. In 2011-2012, during the big flood season, Junee lost access to its most important town, Gundagai, because the road got washed away by the Murrumbidgee. Maurik, which is a major coal mining town, could not export coal because its railway lines got washed out. The graziers couldn't get to market because the river that was 30 metres wide when I crossed it was over 3 kilometres from bank to bank. They deny this climate change. There's still a major social impediment to accepting that climate change is on the horizon, and this is a major impediment to adaptation. Thank you.